So analytic philosophers have worried about speech acts and about the theory of action quite a lot and made, I'm sure, many valuable contributions. My eyes were opened to a serious shortfall in the analytic philosophy of action by a very nice paper by a philosopher of law by the name of Scott Shapiro. It's called Massively Shared Agency, and it points out that when Brackman or Searle talk about human action, they tend to focus on very simple sorts of human collaborations involving friends with common goals. And what they do not think about very much is the fact that when very large organizations, such as large industrial companies or large political administrations, attempt to achieve goals, then at least some fraction of the people involved in those attempts to achieve those goals are going to be alien to the goals. They're going to be there because they want to, for instance, earn a maximal amount of money while doing a minimal amount of work. Or they're just going to be plain stupid and they don't understand the goals. Or they are going to be agents of an alien force who want to undermine the goals. Now, of course, the most interesting cases of such alien forces attempting to undermine goals have to do with military and intelligence kinds of activities. In 2010, General McChrystal created this PowerPoint slide, which is attempting to understand the nature of the massively shared agency on the part of the Western forces at the time of the insurgency. So these are all friendly forces. And there are a number of problems which have to be solved in order to understand this slide. Understand this slide means understanding how all of those friendly forces interact with each other. One of the reasons why ontology has become so important to the military and intelligence community in the US is because all of these different parts of the friendly force constellation have different information systems with different codes and different terminologies. And so they truly cannot speak to each other in any coherent or consistent way. So understanding this slide is in part bringing about a situation where the people fighting the war or the people engaged in civil affairs trying to make friends with the local population understand each other. So this is interoperability not between machines, but between people. Now, another nice feature of this slide is that PowerPoint and large screens, this is a very trivial comment, but it's actually an important comment, make it possible to have an overview of very large constellations of groups engaging in massive shared agency. So the people who are working for coalition domestic support, for instance, they know who their boss is and they know who their colleagues are, but they have really, or they had until this slide was produced, no idea about how they were relating to all the other agencies who were engaged in supporting the war or supporting the local population or making friends with local tribal leaders or doing all of those other things. And similarly, when you're employed in a large university, for instance, you probably have some vague idea that there is a president, and you certainly know who your immediate boss is in the chain of command. But you have really no clear idea about how all the bits and pieces of the university hang together. That's probably a good thing. You don't need to know all of that. But somebody does. And that's what an organigram is. It's an aid to understanding the structure of a large organization. And I think it's more than an aid. I think it is a key. So it actually is isomorphic to the structure of a large organization, at least from some important points of view, which I will be elaborating as we go along. So let's suppose this is a relatively small organization. Let's suppose that the people in this room are an organization. They formed the organization because they have some goal. And what Shapiro says, so I think I would expand on Shapiro in certain directions, but I agree with the main thesis of Shapiro in this paper, that the key to understanding shared agency is authority. The people above you in the chain of command have authority, either directly or indirectly, over you, and the people below you in the chain of command, if you should be so lucky, have subordination to you. In other words, you have authority over them. And authorities are mesh-creating mechanisms. So they are mechanisms for ensuring that disputes do not arise. For instance, when employee X wants to be lazy, or when employee X thinks that the goals of the organization are in fact bad goals, and so we should try and make the organization achieve other goals. That's where authorities come into play. They create a meshing between the actions of different people within the organization, or within the massively shared agency which is being created by creating the organization, or which is being made possible by creating the organization. So, if we are to have authority, then we need to have some people having authority and other people being subordinate to those people. So, she has authority over him, let's suppose. This is an authority relation. And he has authority over them. And in an organization, everybody is joined together by authority links. If they're not joined together by authority links, they're not part of the organization. That's a kind of hypothesis. Now, what you can't have are two people having authority over one person. Because authorities are mesh-creating mechanisms, and if those two people have authority over one person, then you are giving rise to the possibility of a mesh-destroying mechanism, because those two people give conflicting instructions to their subordinate. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have many examples of organizations in which multiple people have authority over one person lower down. So one example, so this is the first big hypothesis. Every member in an organization can have at most one immediate subordinate. At most one, because the capo di tutti capi at the very top doesn't have any superordinate. So cases where somebody may have two superordinates are cases like this. One person is the day manager, another person is the night manager, and he works in the evenings during the period of interchange between day and night. So until 7 o'clock in the evening, he is subordinate to the day manager, and then after 7 o'clock, he's subordinate to the night manager. So there's a kind of timeshare. The person who is his boss is a timeshare of two people. And another, even more common case is where a committee has authority over some subordinate. And now the next hypothesis, I've already formulated it in slightly less formal terms. An organization is an aggregate of persons, and all the persons within this aggregate are linked by deontic relations, primarily the has authority over relation, but as we shall see, there might be other sorts of relations. Now, of course, the organization may have parts in addition to persons which are sub-organizations, and committees are examples of some sub-organizations. And so we're going to need to deal with both organizations and their sub-organizations. And my goal is to try and produce an account of what an organization is, which does justice to all the usual examples of organizations. And a good clue as to whether something is an organization is that it has the word organization in its name. So the World Health Organization is an organization. And I want my account to apply to all the usual examples of organizations. And these are some usual examples. Now, there are many kinds of aggregates of persons which are not organizations. Families, for instance, the collection of fans of a football team, or the collection of people living in Germany, or the collection of people in this room now, we do not form an organization. Maybe Stefana has a weak kind of authority for a few minutes, but still, we do not have an organization here. Very few of us would accept his authority. So, the paradigm examples of organizations in this sense are military organizations, where they have a really beautiful hierarchical structure which has been perfected over the ages, and which is really well documented. And it works beautifully also in the sense that training and promotion up the ranks are two sides of the same coin. There are very complicated and very efficient evaluation systems to allow people to get promoted. And by the time you get to the very top, you are very good. All right, this is another example. It's scruffier looking example, but it's still a perfect hierarchy in the sense I will define in a minute. This is the US Department of State. These are all just examples of organograms to get you acclimatized. The two horizontal lines at the very top indicate that we're not dealing here with relations of authority. Authorities are vertical lines. This is a more aesthetic example, representing a plan of organization for the New York and Erie Railroad. But it's a perfect hierarchy in the sense I'm going to define, even though it's full of these fancy stuff. This is the Los Angeles Police Department. And you can see the authority structure more clearly in this part. So this is the Deputy Chief Paysinger. Paysinger is not his job title, it's his name. And that's Deputy Chief Kalish, who is the head of the West Bureau. And notice that they don't have a head of the Detective Bureau at the moment. They're between heads of the Detective Bureau. So we're going to have to do justice to vacant nodes within the organogram if we're going to understand these structures. And this, as you can see, is the organogram of ISIS. And this is the organogram of Iran. You can't really read that because it's all green, but this is slightly easier to read version. So the supreme leader is Ali Khamenei, but he has to be selected and he can be removed. But the assembly of experts can only do those two things. They can select the supreme leader and remove the supreme leader. But they're not under the authority of the supreme leader. The Supreme National Security Council advises the supreme leader. They are not under the authority of the supreme leader, except to the extent that the people who belong to the Supreme National Security Council almost certainly also belong to one or other of these sub-organizations who are under the authority of the supreme leader. And we'll come back to that in a minute. All right. So what does an organogram contain? This is the ontology of the organogram. Typically, and I believe always, even if it's invisible, an organogram will have a title. It will have a date. Even if it's invisible, there will be a date when it was created. It will sometimes be invalid. That maybe the organization no longer exists. So we're here interested in valid organograms, organograms which represent an existing organization. And then the organogram will have edges, which are the links, and nodes, which are the boxes with the information inside them. And those boxes will have representations of an office, a division within the organization, to which the office will typically be associated as the head. So the office is chief of division. And then the office holder, which may be represented by a name, or by a photograph, or by both of those things. And the office may be empty, may be vacant. And many organograms give you only one or two of these pieces of information. So to have an organigram which has all of those things explicitly, when it's a large organization, is very difficult, because if you have thousands of people working for an organization, it's going to be the case that a few offices become vacant every day. And so the job of keeping the organogram up to date is practically impossible. They will always be out of date. All right, so this is the basic building block for the vertical dimension. And again, you will have an office, a person name, and then another office and another person name, and then a link. And we'll fill in the person names. And then this is the world out here. This is the organogram side. This is an information entity. Represents the world. And then there is a relation of authority, and the edge in the diagram represents that relation of authority. Now, it's clear, this is not a hypothesis, this is, I think, trivial, that the same person may have more than one office. So, this is the ultimate case. Very often people argue that organograms are a very artificial and rather old-fashioned way of understanding organizations. That in the modern world, we have much more exciting and radical ways of understanding organizations. And there are many organizations. People often mention creative industries like advertising, where they don't have this superior-inferior structure anymore. They have teams, collectives, and they work together a bit like a primary school classroom with no boss. Now, this is the pure case where everyone is equal. But then there's still a decision maker, still one decision maker, which is superior to all of the members of the organization, which is the committee which they all form. And every member of such an organization then has two roles. One role is to be a member of the organization, and the other role is to be a member of the committee. And the committee makes the decisions, and it makes the decisions, for instance, by voting. So this is still a valid organogram which links all the members of the organization to one superordinate. Exactly one in this case, which is made up of all the members. Now, what follows from this is that the relation of authority doesn't hold between people, it holds between office holders. And because one person can be the holder of several offices, this means that one person will have different subordinates according to which office we consider that person under. And there are various axioms that we could list. For instance, it can never be the case that one person has one office and is a superior to himself or herself as occupying another office. That would not be allowed. That would just never happen. All right, so these are the office holders. So I haven't very much to say about this yet, but office holders are, roughly speaking, people together with the roles that they have at a certain time. So Mary has the role of Chief of Division 1, and Sally has the role of Assistant Chief of Division 1. And now, from all of the above, it follows that every organization and every valid organogram has the structure of what in graph theory is called an outtree. These are examples of outtrees. The top of the middle outtree is missing. It's bad graphics, I apologize. So these are the outtree axioms. Every outtree is connected, directed, has no cycles, has a single root, and is such that there is a single path from each node to the root. And all of those axioms, I think, you will see by now follow from the intuitive idea about authority, which has been formulated earlier. Now, some people say that there are counterexamples to the hypothesis that every organogram and every organization has the structure of an outtree. So Médecins Sans Frontières is put forward in the web in a romantic kind of way. This is an organization with no head. And of course, so they say that each national office is independent. But if you look more carefully, you will see that while the operational decisions are made largely independently, common policies are coordinated by the International Council. And there is an international office in Geneva which coordinates international activities. So there is a hierarchical structure here. It's just a hierarchical structure that is not... it's not telling the individual organizations in the national clusters what they must do, but then no organization is such that the very top is going to be telling people nearer the bottom what to do. That's not the way organizational structures work. So Médecins Sans Frontières is in fact rather typical. Now another counterexample is the so-called matrix organization, where an organization which has many projects has project managers. And those project managers then work on their projects relatively independently and are then creating a situation where it would seem that the production group, for instance, or just to simplify matters, Herbert has two bosses. So Herbert is a production engineer. He has a boss who is the production manager, and he also has a boss, since he's working now on Project A, who is the Project A manager. Now, this seems to be an intuitive counterexample, but actually, it's really no different from the day manager, night manager case. There is, again, a timeshare. Sometimes Herbert is under the authority of the production manager. Sometimes when he's out on Project A work, he's under the Project A manager. So it's not like this, where Herbert would have two bosses, Fred and Sam. Rather, there are two Herberts, day Herbert and night Herbert. Or production engineer, simpliciter Herbert, and Project A production engineer, Herbert, when he's working in Project A. And then we have two distinct subordination relations between day Herbert and night Herbert, and two distinct authorities over Herbert. But now Herbert himself has two distinct roles. So this is not any different from the fact that people can be parts of distinct committees within an organization, or be day managers and night managers. So these are distinct sub-organizations, and then they have a common boss, who is the general manager, which we saw already on the original diagram. And this is very common in joint operations. So when NATO organizes a joint operation, the commander of the force, or let's say a Norwegian, will be a commander for the time when the forces from America and Holland and so on are involved in the joint operation. They will be lent to the joint force and then sent back to their home authority when the joint operation is finished. So this is very common and very well documented, graph-theoretically, exactly along the lines I've been describing in joint doctrine, NATO joint doctrine. And I mentioned there are other sorts of edges within organograms. So people can advise the head, people can oversee the operations of the organization and thereby also evaluate the head. People can audit the head. People can appoint the head. And often these kinds of horizontal relations to the organization are managed by boards or committees, board of directors. And that's perfectly consistent with what I've been saying so far. So this is the Luxembourg Railway Company. And there is an audit committee, which is neither over nor under the administrative head. And this is the Iran case again, which we've already seen. All right, so what is superordination? What does it mean to be over another person in another role within an organization? Now, what I'm going to say next relates primarily to organizations which have employment relations. And I haven't worked this through for voluntary associations and the like. But I think something similar, albeit something weaker, will hold where we're dealing with voluntary associations. So Mary is chief of Division 1, and she will have an employment contract. And the employment contract will say, you will be able to tell your assistant what to do under the following headings. So the employment contract will specify a series of powers. And at the same time, it will say, you have to do what your boss, the general manager, tells you. So it will give you certain duties. It will specify them in the contract. And then your assistant, similarly, will have an employment contract which specifies her duties, which are symmetrical to your powers. So your powers are to tell her what to do. Her duties are to do what you tell her to do, roughly speaking. So we have a mutual dependence here between the duties and powers of the underling and the powers and duties of the superordinate. And this means that the employment contracts play a role in sustaining the offices by specifying the duties and powers associated with those offices. Okay, so organizations can have two sorts of member parts. I say member parts because although my lung is a part of me, it's not a part of the University at Buffalo. It's not a member part, anyway. I am a member part of the University at Buffalo. But also the Department of Philosophy is a member part of the University at Buffalo because it's a sub-organization. So, and how do we define a sub-organization? Well, it's a proper part of an organization which can be represented by an organigram, along the lines I've been suggesting. Now, there are different ways in which an organigram may represent a sub-organization. It can represent all its member parts, or it can represent all its sub-organizations. So it can represent all the people, or it can represent all the offices. And there are different combinations here. But if we think this through, we can see that there is an idea of a complete representation, which would represent all the sub-organizations, all the offices, and all the office holders. And then there are two kinds of incompleteness. One would be where an organigram just doesn't list the names of all the office holders because no one entered them into the Organigram software. And the other is where there is nobody in those offices because they're vacant. So this is vacant in the world, this is vacant in the information. This is a case of vacant in the world. They just don't know yet. Well, I'm assuming, anyway, on that day, they were doing their job properly and there wasn't anybody to take a photograph of. So we can define an organigram to be complete if it represents all the sub-organizations, all the offices, and all the member parts. And then an organization is complete if it has no vacant offices and if it can be represented by a complete organigram as defined here. So the Department of Defense and all the military services in the US are never complete. Now we will say that an organigram is maximal if it's not a proper part of any larger organigram. So this would be an organigram corresponding to what I will call an organization proper, which is an organization which is not a sub-organization of any other organization. And an organization proper, then, is an organization that can be represented by a maximal organigram. And now I have a conclusion. And this follows that the government of the United States is not an organization proper because it's not an organization. It's three organizations.
Under God.
Thank you. That's it. Benito.
Oh, thank you very much. Any questions?
Isabel, you need the microphone. Come in.
It's all right, no problem.
Thank you, Professor, for the very, very, very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you several questions, but one of them is what you think this hierarchical structure is a universal structure you can find in every company, for example, or there are other theories. For example, Eckhart Schlicht thinks that organization are based can be considered an island of custom, based on custom. Other that the contract is the root of the organization, and there is for example, cause thing that there is a hierarchical structure in the organization, but the contract is the basis of the organization. So the questions are two. The first is there are other models possible in organization in companies, mainly companies. And the second is if the contract, what is the rule of the contract in this organization system?
Good. So, first of all, I said that I was focusing primarily towards the end of the presentation on industrial organizations with employment relations. And there we have contracts through and through, I would say. And I really just have not thought through the issue of whether the same ideas about duties and powers and mutual dependence and specifications can be applied to non-contract based organizations. But it's clear that there are organizations which are much more loosely based than industrial employment organizations. So I don't have any problems with that. My assumption is that the same hierarchical structure will apply there also. But it will apply, there will be more voting or more decisions by consensus. There will still be decision-making bodies who are superior to the people who have to follow the decisions made by the decision-making bodies. So if we have, imagine a chess club in a school, for instance. So the members of the chess club join together and they say, well, you can be secretary, you can be treasurer, you can be president. And then they will have some kind of very loose articles of association, which may not be formulated in writing, which will allow the president to decide how often they meet and when they meet and whether they go to this or that competition and who will pay for it and so on. Now, with regard to custom, every organization will have its own customs, and every sub-organization will have its own customs, and the customs will, in some cases, overwhelm the authority which is contractually determined. So you may be in a sub-organization, well, not you, because I'm sure this never happens in Italy, but some of us may be in a sub-organization where everybody knows that the boss is an idiot. And so he tells you what to do, but then everyone just ignores it and continues doing the proper thing. So I don't deny that there is custom which can sometimes overwhelm the contractually determined authority relations. Those authority relations still play a role in determining things like salaries, employment, reasons for firing somebody, and so on. So you still have to pay attention to them, even if your boss is an idiot. Roberto?
So the productivity of the accounting system is, as usual, tested on the boundary.
Yeah.
And I think there are many interesting cases around. One is the case of a cruise ship, in which there is a clear organigram from the captain down to the humblest worker, never sees the deck.
Kitchen stuff.
Yeah. And also that the captain has also authority on all passengers in a non-organizational
Yep,
way.
yep.
And it's not clear to me actually whether the countless kitchen staff whether they have authority on passengers in case there is a problem. It's not completely clear.
Okay, let me deal with that one first.
But just to say that you have a case in which authority is necessary but not sufficient for organization. So there is no organization in this case for the passengers.
So,
The crew, but
okay, but there is a much easier example of the same sort, which is the authority the government has over the citizens. And I think that that is just a fact that some organizations are there in order to be able to exercise authority over non-members of the organization. They still have the authority relations within the organization, but there's a very different kind of authority relation which points outwards. So I don't think the ship case is a special case. I don't think it's even a borderline case.
And also, one factual point is said that one cannot be a subordinate of oneself.
Yes.
I think there are cases that contradict this. For instance, Mussolini in 30 something, he had a deputy minister for the interior, and he advocated himself back into the faction. So basically, it was Michel, but he was both the prime minister and the deputy.
Okay, so I think that in those sorts of cases, it's not quite the day manager and the night manager, but it's something like that. So when Mussolini was behaving as head of state, he had one office, and when he was behaving as Minister of Defense, he had another office. And actually, this is an interesting kind of case. So it doesn't make sense, I believe, to say that Mussolini had authority over himself. But I agree with you that there is a puzzle there which needs to be addressed. So another interesting case of that puzzle is the personal union of the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. So they were one and the same person. I don't think it makes sense there to say that the Emperor of Austria had authority over the King of Hungary, for a number of reasons. But still, I will think about that.
Barry, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting and clear, as usually. I never thought about Organigram, but for me it's a very interesting phenomenon, and also this concept. I think for me it's a useful conceptual instrument in two different fields. Social ontology, but also philosophy of graphic rules or normative drawing, maybe. So I have two orders of questions. About ontology, what is the status of Organigram? It is a document, maybe or not? Because it was interesting that you said that one organigram can be valid, and it is an important feature for your talk. And the second question, also in this field of social ontology, what is the object represented by Organigram? Because I think it's very interesting also for the theory of institution in social ontology. And about philosophy of normative drawings or graphic rules, so more connected with the topic of our meeting. Do you think that Organigram can have also a deontic function, so some normative force?
So there is Organigram software. You can buy it, and big organizations do buy it and use it to maintain their Organigram, because it's an important function for big companies that they can maintain their Organigram. But there were very big organigrams which were being maintained before there were computers and software. So the organigram of the Allied forces under General Eisenhower in the Second World War was huge, and it was maintained on paper. I imagine they used a lot of tape to glue the paper together. They had real problems organizing the D-Day landings, for instance. The number of documents that they had to create and maintain during that period probably wouldn't have fitted into this room. It's much easier now because we have computers. Now, what does the organigram represent? It represents organizational structure. Does it represent all aspects of organizational structure? No, and partly for the reasons that Olympia pointed out, there are other kinds of motive forces, dimensions, which are at work in every organization. Some people say this means that organigrams are artificial, abstract, old-fashioned, naive ways of representing organizational structure. I think that they are actually still perfectly good, providing you understand that you're dealing here with the kind of structure which has to do with authority relations as specified in things like contracts. And then, do they have a normative force? Well, I think that there are two questions here. One is the question whether the organigram structure in general, the type, the universal, has a normative force. And I think it does, but that's just because of these simple intuitive truths to the effect that you can't have two bosses and have an efficient, effective organization. So that's a normative consequence, not of any paper or software artifact, but of the authority relation and the intuitive axioms which govern it. Does a specific organigram have normative structure? Yes. The Department of State in the US has to have a head of the Division of Middle Eastern Affairs. That's a normative thing. And if she resigns, you have to appoint an interim, and then you have to go searching for a proper replacement. So that's normative. And whether it's normative, I think it probably is normative of the organigram. This is the organizational structure because the organigram says so.
No, because the problem is if the normative force is of the organigram or of the institution.
So I think this connects up with what we've been talking about, which is that the legal document which specifies how the Department of State is organized will contain, I haven't checked, but it will contain something like an organigram as a graphic representation.
Thank you.
First, Valeria.
Thank you very much. I have maybe a minor point, but I want, because in the analogy between organograms and graphs in math, you didn't distinguish between a simple graph and an oriented graph, but many of the cases that you were giving contain errors, which are directed.
Yes.
And so, instead, in your presentation of the organogram, you were talking only on the vertical relation that is like the authority. And errors needs to be disambiguated because sometimes they mean they happen to mean authority as well. Some other times they were.
Yes.
So I'm just.
Yeah, you're right.
If you make
Yes.
a distinction between
Yeah.
oriented graph and simple graphs
Yeah.
and organogram.
Yeah. So I was talking primarily about the authority relation and the directed graph, which captures the authority relation for an organization. I did mention in passing that there were other connections, such as board of directors, advisors, auditors, and so on. They are not authority relations. So I need to make that explicit, and I did not do that. So you're right.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a kind of general introduction to the philosophy of the organograms as well of the deontic connection within organization and so on. Yeah, a thing that is particularly wondering from my point of view is the fact that these organograms can be read from two different perspectives. At least you seem to be doing that during the presentation. For example, an organogram can be read functionally as directed to a particular goal. Otherwise, you can read it deontically as a kind of deontic relation authorities and relations of subordination with other members of the organization and so on. So, since you at a certain point choose the example of members of an organization who are in fact not at all aware of a global goal of the organization, I'm wondering about the possibility of a switch between the two planes, the functional one and the deontic one. And maybe that this switch can be functional for the goal of the organization as well. And in particular, when you talked about military operations, which is the most common example about this possibility, when your allied maybe do not need to know your entire intentions from a strategical point of view, and so on. So, what do you think about these possibilities?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, Scott Shapiro has an account which is connected very much with his story about massive agency of what the law is for. The law is a mesh-creating mechanism which allows people to engage in massive social agency at minimal risk. So if you have the law, and if somebody cheats you, you can use the law in order to punish the cheater, and therefore you'll have fewer cheaters. And therefore, large organizations can achieve their ends, and that means people can invest in them with some security more successfully than without the law. Now, I think the same thing applies in the specific case of organizations. So an organization has a function. That means it wants to achieve certain goals. It's going to invest huge resources in achieving those goals. And in order to be sure, in order to have some security that it will indeed achieve those goals, it has to have deontic relations over the members of the organization. But you're right, the members of the organization don't need to know that they are part of an organization with this particular role in the larger goal.
Is it supposed to be a static diagram, and then, for example, we can have other diagrams associated to it, for example, who communicates with whom, project priorities?
Yes, good, yeah. So first of all, the software for maintaining organograms is there because organogram structures can change over time, so you need to redraw the organogram. And then there may be an authority in the organization which has the authority to create new offices or new sub-organizations. So that's one way in which the organogram is dynamic. Then there is another way, and there is a lot of web content addressing this point, another way in which other graph-theoretic structures are created to represent workflows within the organization or communication flows. So absolutely, I agree that they are more dynamic still.
I just had a number of short comments by way of footnotes. One of them is, I'm glad you just came back to the issue of massive agency where you began. As most of us know, and this is just an analogy to maps, most people, just the way you don't unroll a map of Europe to find out, how to get to a restaurant. Most people use small maps, and they assume that there is a coherent isomorphic space that extends beyond, and that there are other little maps. And aside from that, it's, don't ask me, I just work here. And that's how most people work inside bureaucracies. And that's, of course, how the military, etc., works. That you aren't supposed to look beyond. You're actually trained to work on a small map. You get a bigger map later on. The second thought that I had, and it isn't a problem for you, but it's interesting, the ideal of anarchy, which people misunderstand. Anarchy means no arche. No arche doesn't mean no leader. It means no prima facie leader. In anarchy, it's a cooperative group in which, as people's expertise and knowledge are more required, they come to the front. It's an ideal. I mean, a family should work that way, and so on. So I was just thinking, as you were speaking, you could have a description of an anarchy with a quite complex net of nodes and so on. But what represents the anarchy is the way that it's used, the flow of the individuals through it. depending on the situation, you take that, it's like, you be pilot and co-pilot, or a sailor like Roberto will know, I'm going to sleep, so you be captain. So the rigidity of just because you see a big thing like it doesn't really mean it's rigid. The flow of the individuals through it is really what's crucial.
I'm tempted to say that your kind of anarchy, as you just described it, would come to the fore in an emergency for the 9/11 when people were trying to escape. I'm sure people with certain kinds of expertise came to the fore and led groups of other people in a very beautiful anarchic
This is where human
way.
beings are at their best.
Yeah.
We have time for others to brief one and then Robert.
Brief comment. I'm a neurologist, and your talk was fascinating to me because some issues you just illustrated before fit very well with the organization of the brain. And included the graph theory. And my question is making a parallel between how brain works, very short, very roughly also, and what is the in your opinion, the Achilles heel of this kind of structure? I mean, the organization, the organigram, must crack if you are allowed to use this term, because maybe there is some impalpable item which is not calculated, and in my opinion is the motivation, because the motivation is the synchrony of the entire network, and the motivation is not palpable. We have the motivation in the brain structure because the synchrony, the synapses or whatever is organized by the oscillation, of the rhythm. And you have the synchrony, and the motivation is get by the synchrony. And the issues, the spike, came from organization of this kind of. What do you think about that?
So I've been working quite a lot with military people recently. And I've mentioned earlier that there is a coordination between training, evaluation, and promotion. So every military person is constantly being evaluated and constantly being trained and constantly being promoted. And the people who don't have the motivation just go, they leave. So the military are really very well motivated. And I think that goes hand in hand with the fact that they can manage these gigantic organograms without cracking.
But many people have raised the issue of the analogy between organograms and maps. And I think you should be pushed in some detail. One thing that you learn, the first thing that you learn in France, and we talked about French bureaucracy, the last thing you're supposed to forget is that there is what is called the hiérarchie.
The what?
The hiérarchie.
Yeah.
That means
I get
you
it.
only have to try to address the problem by talking to the immediate superordinate.
Yeah.
And you bypassing, it creates a double problem, so we are.
Yeah. So that is an important point, actually.
And so diagrams are used for navigation, and which means you can incorporate in your understanding of diagrams a number of ideas from any theory of navigation perspective. I am in a certain role, and there is a certain perspective on the organization, which depends on my position.
Yeah.
So a number of things like that are just coming for free from navigation theory and theory of maps.
Yeah, I agree. So the small maps point is, I tried to make it without mentioning maps at the beginning, but I can see that making it in terms of maps and navigation would be an interesting. But you're navigating only through to the nearest restaurant. You're not navigating through to Vladivostok. Oh, we're not, anyway.
Wasn't your example of the railway organogram somehow spatially organized as well?
Oh, yes, and the Department of State is spatially organized. So Middle Eastern affairs, I don't know, Canada affairs.
I meant the organogram that's showing actually ray lines. Oh no, the from the start, the aesthetically.
Oh, there, yes. Let me. I don't know. We'd have to expand it. So this is a good test of the power of PowerPoint.
On this, I think it's actually showing
The stations.
where the track stations and
Yeah.
the hierarchies.
Yeah. So can you read that? I think probably you're right. So that's an interesting point. So that would be a Organimap.
Okay.
Just a last question. Has the Pentagon ever thought of dropping their organograms on the image?
That's not a good question.
Okay, to conclude, I have a minimal comment. I don't know if I have the authority to give me the possibility of presenting a question or if this is similar to Mussolini's situation. Anyway, my comment is this. As you know very well, Friedrich von Hayek distinguished between made order or organizations and spontaneous order, that is, emergent social formations. Usually, he says that the differences are according to the form of authority, the kind of commands, the relationships among members. After listening to your very interesting presentation, it seems to me that we can say that the difference between them is that the organigram is very good for understanding organization, while it doesn't work to understand the spontaneous order. Maybe the brain is somewhere in the middle between spontaneous order and an organization.
They have both. They have both.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.